Ladies, happy Friday. I hope you're doing well. I'm jumping on for another hot topic. We are talking about, I said hunger and cravings, but we're going to kind of dive more into hunger today. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the different things that affect our hunger. And we're also going to dive into what we can do about it. Okay. So let me just pull up my notes here so that I don't forget anything. And then at the same time, I will just jump online over on here, make sure that I can see you guys if you're jumping on with me. Okay, so here are my notes. So that you guys can see that at the same time. Okay. So why is this topic really important for everyone that is going through the program or has been through the program? I want you to understand that hunger management or managing hunger and feeling satisfied is going to be extremely key when you are in a fat loss phase, which most of you that are currently in the program are in a fat loss phase. And so again, what we're going to look at today is what influences hunger and satiety and what might drive you to eat and how to fix it. Okay. You're already doing a lot of this stuff because you're in the program and it's all part of the program. But I always like to say that the more you can understand why we do things inside this program, the more likely you are to follow my recommendations. So again, the important thing to understand is that in order to create a sustained caloric deficit, which is what we're trying to do here, you need to be able to manage your hunger and you need to feel satisfied, because if you're not, it's going to be really hard to remain consistent. And I think this is one of the problems with so many of the different, quick fix diets out there that promise rapid weight loss, is that they don't manage your hunger. And this is why women have a hard time staying on track, and they end up, white knuckling their way through the diet until they come to the point where they're like, oh my God, I just need to eat, and they can't control it. So hunger management is super, super key. So let's look at what influences hunger. And I want you to think of this, when you're thinking of hunger, I want you to think of it on 3 different levels. And we're going to look at these different levels together. So number one, the first level, the top level, is your brain. So your brain controls hunger. And this happens in the hypothalamus. And your brain is what decides what you're going to do. It's really hard to fight your brain. Okay. It will drive behavior. Now, the mid-level is your hormones. And I'm going to explain how this works, but just understand that your hormones are going to control what happens in your brain. And then that bottom level, which we're going to get to, is nutrition and lifestyle, which is what we're working on. Nutrition and lifestyle influence your hormones, which influence your brain. Okay. So there's, again, different levels or different layers of things that are going to determine what your hunger levels are like and whether you have the ability to stay on track or not. So let's look at that first top layer, which again is your brain. And so what I want you to understand is that I won't get overly sciencey here, but you have neurons in your brain. And there is one type of neuron in your brain that drives hunger, right? So makes you feel hungry, makes you seek out food, and also lowers energy expenditure. So how many calories you are burning. Okay, this is really important to understand. So if you're stimulating that neuron in your brain, not only are you going to feel hungry, but the amount of calories that you burn are going to go down. Okay, so we don't want that neuron to be activated all the time when we're in a fat loss phase. Now, on the flip side, there's another neuron. When that one gets activated or stimulated, that neuron is going to suppress hunger and make us feel satisfied. And it's going to increase our energy expenditure or increase how many calories we burn. So that's the neuron that we're like, yeah, that's what we want. Okay. So that happens at the level of the brain. Now, from there, then we get to our mid-level, which is hormones. And in this program, we work a lot on hormones, right? And as you heard me say before, when it comes to hormones, it's all about balance. Goldilocks principle. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want just the right amount. And this really applies to all hormones: estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, insulin, cortisol, all of them. But specifically what we're looking at now is we're going to look at your hunger hormones, because the same is true here. So the two sort of main hormones that are going to have an impact on those neurons in your brain that drive hunger are ghrelin and leptin. Okay, so ghrelin, here's how I here's a funny story. The first time I started learning about ghrelin, this was like way back in my early 30s, but I read a book by Dr. Oz, and it was about understanding your body. And he talked about ghrelin and leptin. It was the first time I'd ever heard of ghrelin or leptin. But I remember that this is from him, that I could remember that ghrelin was grr, like gremlins, grr, ghrelin, like makes you feel hungry. So if you want to remember that, just remember ghrelin is grr, I'm hungry. Okay. So ghrelin, if the more ghrelin you have, because ghrelin is the hunger hormone. Okay. Just remember that. So the more ghrelin you have, it's going to stimulate the neurons in your brain that are going to increase hunger and lower energy expenditure, how many calories you burn. Okay. So the more ghrelin you have, the more hunger you're going to feel and the less calories you're going to burn. So obviously this is one of those hormones that we don't want too much, right? We want to keep it in check. And it's normal to have, we need some ghrelin. This is what's going to drive us to go and make 3 healthy meals a day. We just don't want too much ghrelin. Okay. Now, the other thing about ghrelin, it's a very powerful hormone because it also suppresses the neurons that suppress appetite and increase energy expenditure. Okay. So again, it can be very powerful, and we have to be able to manage or balance out this hormone. So ghrelin is going to naturally go up the longer we go without food. And this is why you start to get hungry, right? So when you eat a meal, like immediately after, your ghrelin levels are going to be quite low. But as within 2, 3, 4 hours, however long it may be, you're going to start to see a rise in ghrelin, which is going to turn on those neurons. They're going to tell you to go find some food in the fridge, right? So that's kind of how it works. Now, again, when in balance, this is great because it just reminds us, hey, you haven't given your body any food in a while. You've got to go get some more, but it can be problematic within the context of again, if you're in a fat loss phase, if you have too much ghrelin and you are hungry all of the time, and on top of that, the calories that you're burning start to go down, you can see how this is going to be problematic. So too much ghrelin is what we want to avoid. Now, some of the things that are going to affect your ghrelin is poor sleep and stress, okay? And that's why these are key components of the program. That's why stress management is weaved throughout the program. And that's why, depending on where you're at in the program, we're going to start talking about sleep. Because if you have poor sleep, and on top of that, you're super stressed, you're probably going to have too much ghrelin going around in your body, and your total daily energy expenditure will therefore go down, or calories burned. This is going to be a problem. Okay, so that's ghrelin. Now, the other main one is leptin, and leptin is kind of a fascinating, I'll just blow this up a bit. It's a pretty fascinating hormone. And I'm going to do a whole hot topic on leptin because it's a hormone that is, it's got so many little subtleties to it, but essentially, and I'll come back to ghrelin for a second, but essentially leptin is the opposite of ghrelin. So whereas ghrelin drives hunger, leptin helps us feel satiated. Okay, this is what gives us that feeling of satisfaction in between our meals when we do not feel the need to eat. So it makes us feel satiated, and it increases energy expenditure. So it increases how many calories we burn in a daily basis. So it's a good one to have. But again, Goldilocks principle, and we'll talk a little bit about that, like not too much, not too little, but just right. Now, super interesting is that, so leptin is created in our body fat, and it's influenced by our body fat. And so the more body fat that we have, the more leptin we have, which means we have less hunger and we burn more calories. The less body fat we have, the less leptin we have, the hungrier we get, and our energy expenditure goes down. Again, if you always think of the body as like this magical system that was designed way back when to keep us alive. This makes perfect sense. If you were, a cave woman and you started losing a lot of weight and you had less body fat, it would make sense for your brain to start for leptin to go down and for your brain to start driving you to find food, right? It's always like, well, why would the body do this? That's always a great question to ask. Now, with leptin, again, if you're just like, wow, leptin sounds great, let's just like go out and get some more leptin in my body. The thing is that you can develop leptin resistance, the same as you can develop insulin resistance. And so this will happen in women that have too much body fat. Because like I said, the more body fat you have, the more leptin you have to a certain degree. Because the same as insulin, this is the same as what happens with insulin resistance and the cells. So let's say you have too much body fat, you have all of this leptin getting produced in your body, your brain eventually just stops listening. It's kind of like listening to a screaming child that's like, hey, like turn on those neurons. And your brain eventually is like, I can't even hear you anymore. So if you think of what happens then what happens is that your brain doesn't ever get stimulated to suppress your appetite and increase your energy expenditure. And therefore, this is one of those root causes of stubborn weight loss. For some women, this is what drives them to eat all the time, and they can't stop themselves because they never feel satiated. But also, they probably have a much lower energy expenditure than they should have because leptin isn't around to drive it up. So you can see how this is all going to have an impact on your results. Now, another interesting thing when it comes to leptin is that energy availability in your body is also going to impact your leptin levels. Okay, so that means like how many calories you're giving your body. And as you guys know, in this program, I'm very conscientious of not dropping your calories too low for too long. And it has everything to do with how your calories in impact leptin. So if you go into a caloric deficit and there is less energy than your body needs, you will see a reduction in leptin, right? So less leptin means there's less activity in the brain that suppresses appetite and increases energy expenditure or calories burned. So we have to be careful when we go into that caloric deficit that we're not throwing leptin out of whack. And we're going to talk about what we're doing inside this program to make that happen. But just so you start to understand how these hormones influence your brain. So just remember that ghrelin is going to stimulate the brain to drive hunger and slow down calorie burn. Leptin is going to tell the brain to suppress hunger and increase calorie burn when they are imbalanced. But there are lots of reasons that they can get out of balance. And I'm just going to go back to ghrelin because I forgot to talk about two things here. So ghrelin, again, this is the hunger hormone. So one thing, when I first started looking into perimenopause and menopause and how our hormones change, one thing that I found in my research was that ghrelin goes up in perimenopause. Not so much postmenopause, but in perimenopause. So leading up to menopause, ghrelin goes up. So ghrelin, once again, what does it do? It tells the brain to increase hunger and slow down energy expenditure. So this is one of the other hormonal changes that make it so hard to manage our weight during perimenopause. And then the other thing that I want to talk about quickly is just ghrelin resistance. So if you think of insulin, or if you think of leptin resistance as the brain just ignoring leptin because it's tired of hearing it, Well, ghrelin resistance is the brain ignoring ghrelin because it's tired of hearing it. So ghrelin, which is telling the body to eat more food, right? And if you imagine if your body starts to ignore that, then you would never be hungry. And there are lots of theories that believe that when women go on these 1,200, 1,000 calorie diets for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, they develop this ghrelin resistance. And I see this in a lot of my clients where, you know, those that have come to me with a background of heavy dieting, they struggle to eat 12, 13, 14, 1,500 calories. And it's probably because their brain at this point just isn't even listening to ghrelin because it's just developed that resistance. Okay. So again, just so you understand, I find all this stuff very fascinating. Okay. So there are, those are kind of like the two main hormones that are going to stimulate the brain. Insulin, when it is in balance, is also going to suppress hunger and increase energy expenditure, much like leptin does. But again, that's only when it's in balance. When we have too much insulin, it doesn't really work that way anymore. But again, insulin isn't necessarily a bad hormone when it's in balance. And then there are all these other tiny hormones, like I won't talk about all of them, but just know that it's more complex than just ghrelin and leptin, but those are sort of like the two main players. And then there's all these different hormones that get secreted by the body, in the stomach and the small intestine, that are all going to impact your brain. And what's important to understand here is that what you do with your nutrition and your lifestyle is going to impact those hormones, which are going to impact your brain. Okay, so we are working from the top up. Okay. Now, besides hormones, stomach expansion, right? So when you eat and your stomach goes from this big to say this big or whatever it may be, that is going to act very much like leptin. Okay, so when your stomach expands, it's going to stimulate the neurons that are going to suppress your hunger and drive energy expenditure up. Okay, and it does this via the vagus nerve. You don't need to know that. And the interesting thing here, and we're going to come back to this, is that when it comes to stomach expansion, it doesn't matter how many calories you're eating, it's the volume of your food. Okay, so that's a big hint there, the volume of your food. So it's just the mechanical action of expanding your stomach that's going to stimulate the right neurons in your brain. Okay, so just remember that. We're going to come back to it. Okay, so now that was the mid-level. So again, bottom level, right? So again, if we understand that our habits influence our hormones stimulate the neurons that are going to determine what happens with our hunger and what happens with our calorie burn. So what in our life is going to impact those hormones? So sleep, poor sleep, I kind of talked about that. Shift work, like women who work overnight, any kind of circadian disruption, like when you are jet lagged, maybe you've noticed that when you're on a plane, you're like hungry all the time. Social jet lag, which is, if you've never heard of that term, this is like for like women who like to stay up really late on the weekends, and that will disrupt your circadian rhythm. So all of these things are likely going to drive ghrelin up. Okay, your stress, and just like your nervous system. So when we're talking about stress, ultimately we're talking about your nervous system. We're talking about your parasympathetic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the one that gets triggered when we're stressed out. All of those are going to stimulate ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. Obesity, we kind of talked about this, right? The more body fat we have, the more leptin we have, which is good to a point until it creates leptin resistance. Dieting, excessive dieting, which is going to drive hunger and eventually cause ghrelin resistance, which ultimately will have an impact on our ability to lose weight. Inflammation, macros, right? We do a lot of, we work on macros inside this program, but the amount of protein, carbs, and fat, and we'll dig into this a little bit more, but that's going to have an impact on your ghrelin and leptin. And I'll explain a little bit more in a bit here, or I mean, I can explain it now, I guess, but it really here, it's going to have to do with the speed of digestion, because like I said, ghrelin will rise as you know, the longer you haven't eaten, as your food moves from your stomach through your small intestine and gets broken down, the faster that process is happening, the faster you're going to have more ghrelin. So when we play around with our macros and we play around with the speed of our digestion, then we play around ultimately with our ghrelin levels. Our food quality, and this again, this is about speed, but also volume, right? So food quality, like whether you're eating donuts versus choosing sweet potatoes when you want to eat carbs. And then food volume, so getting 200 calories from M&M versus 200 calories from broccoli. And this goes back to that expansion of the stomach, okay? So let's talk about what you can do to control your hunger hormones. And again, I want you to think here that there are 3 spheres of control, and actually it's more like 2. So if you've seen one of about, I don't know, it was probably 2 months ago, we did a little exercise on stress, and I talked about the spheres of control and how some things we have 0 control over, some things we have some control over, and some things we have total control over. Well, when it comes to our hunger hormones, I want you to think about it in that sort of sense, in the sense that you have no control over your brain. You cannot say, hey, brain, can you please activate the neurons that are going to suppress my hunger and drive my calorie burn? Nope, you cannot do that. You cannot do that unless you have some superpowers that I am unaware of. At the mid-level, at the hormonal level, you also can't do that. You cannot say, hey, body, can you jack up my leptin levels for the next 3 months? I'm trying to lose weight. Wouldn't that be fantastic? But we can't do that. The only place that we have power, that we have control, is our nutrition and our lifestyle choices. Which brings me to sort of like what we're doing inside the program, which is this idea of hunger management from the bottom up. So what can we do with our nutrition and our lifestyle to manage our hormones and stimulate the right neurons in our brain to make it that much easier to stay in control of our choices, stay in control of our hunger, stay more consistent for a sustained period of time and get the results that we want. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that we can do, and we'll talk about what we're doing inside the program. So number 1 is I want you to think about it as hunger hacking. Okay, and we do this inside the program, but hunger hacking is going to be like really important for you. And when it comes to hunger hacking, to me, it's about slowing down digestion, right? The slower your body is digesting your foods, the slower the time, the more time is going to go on after your meal before ghrelin starts to go up again. Here, what's going to slow down digestion? Protein, right? Protein is super key here. This is why I want you ladies to be eating at a very minimum at 20 grams per meal, but I would prefer to see that closer to 30, okay? 20 to 30, ideally 30, because that is going to slow down digestion and it's going to keep ghrelin at bay for as long as possible. And then the second one is fiber, right? So obviously we can get fiber from vegetables, we can get fiber from nuts and seeds. If you are having a smart carb day, if you're eating more carbohydrates, this is why smart carbs are key, because they are high in fiber and slower to digest, all of which is going to give you some control over ghrelin and therefore over your brain and your hunger, okay? The second thing on my list is volume hacking. So very similar to hunger hacking, but not totally. So volume hacking has less to do with the speed of digestion and more to do with that mechanical expansion of your stomach. So what can you do to expand your stomach as much as possible? And here what you want is high volume foods, so foods that take up a lot of space in your belly, but are low in calories, AKA vegetables and water, okay? Vegetables and water, not fat, because fat, yes, it might give you a ton of calories, right? But it's not going to take up much space in your body, in your stomach, right? So this is why I think that, making sure that you're getting the 2 to 3/5 of vegetables, definitely with lunch and dinner, potentially even with breakfast, is going to help, because, and this is why you guys always tell me like, oh my God, those protein shakes, they're so filling. Like I have one of those protein shakes and it lasts me like 4 hours. And it's probably because part of it is probably because of the volume of those shakes. They take up a lot of room, especially if you make yours like mine and you add a ton of water. And yeah, your belly's going to expand, but you're not necessarily giving yourself like 1,000 calories in that one protein shake. Okay, so understanding that this is something that you can work on is making sure that when you're building your meals, you're adding in foods that are taking up a lot of space but are low in calories. So, and then I put here like sort of like your hunger management formula, right? And so if you guys, if you're doing my program right now, or you're off of the program, you've completed it, but right now you're struggling with hunger, you go back to this formula. It's the same one that I've been teaching you: protein, right? And veggies at every meal, even breakfast if you're struggling, okay? To slow down digestion and to take up volume. And then 1 liter of water in between those meals. So if you did protein and veggies for breakfast, right? With an emphasis on the veggies to fill up your belly. And then you did 1 liter of water. And then you did protein and vegetables for lunch with an emphasis on the vegetables, and then you did 1 liter of water, and then you did the same thing for dinner, I guarantee that you're going to have more control over your hunger, okay? Because you're going to control how your body starts to produce ghrelin, okay? So that's going to be another one. Sleep is super, super key. And that's why it's something that we work on. Again, what you need to work on doing is working up to 7 to 9 hours of good quality sleep, because that's going to drop your ghrelin levels back to a normal level, which is what we want. So if you're still struggling with sleep, reach out to me for sure. Or if we have a one-on-one coaching system, just make sure you bring it up with me so that we can address it and work on your sleep hygiene, right? Work on what you can do during the day to set yourself up for a good night's sleep at night. And you can Google like sleep inside the Slow and Steady Club, because I've done probably two different hot topic sessions on sleep that you can watch. Stress management is also going to be key, because again, stress is going to drive ghrelin. So we need to make stress management something that we make a priority, just as much as we prioritize cooking healthy foods and getting out for our walks and doing our workouts. It's going to have a massive impact. Stress eating, right? Stress eating. So we need to, it just has to be part of it. And, I know a lot of women, when they start to think about weight loss or fat loss, their minds go straight to like nutrition and workouts. But stress management, like it is, and sleep, they are pillars. They really, really need to become a priority. Exercise, I put exercise in there, and I've talked about this before, but I know some of you are potentially new, or you haven't heard me say this, but understand that too much exercise is going to drive hunger. And that will have to do with the energy availability in the body, right? So if you remember when I was talking about leptin, if energy availability is too low versus what the body's demands are at that time, it is going to drop leptin and drive hunger. And so making sure that we're exercising, but not too much, right? So that's why I'm not a huge fan of like the 1 hour workouts or going for a run, like cardio in general. I'm not a big fan of. I prefer that you do the short workouts, like short and intense, over and done with, or go for a walk. Because that's going to help you managing your hunger. The next thing on the list, again, these are all things that we're doing inside the program, is creating a slight caloric deficit as opposed to a big caloric deficit, going back to leptin and energy availability. So the deeper the depth and duration of a diet, the more impact it's going to have on leptin. So the deeper the diet, the longer the diet, the lower the leptin, right? So less leptin. Remember that leptin suppresses our appetite and drives energy expenditure up. And so we want to keep that one high. And if we go into this deep deficit, we're going to tank it. Okay. So we want to create a slight energy deficit. And then IER, which is intermittent energy restriction, depending on where you're at, we'll learn all about this. But this is why we take diet breaks. This is why we have boost days on the weekends and flex meals on the weekends, and why we have carb cycling when we're moving into intermittent fasting, because the days that we're boosting our energy intake up, we're also signaling to the body to increase leptin, because we're saying, hey, there is plenty of energy availability, so don't stress out. You can just pump up that leptin, suppress our appetite, drive up our calories burned every single day. Okay, so that's going to be important. Now, carb cycling, also carbohydrates will boost leptin more than fat and more than protein. And so that's why, yes, I love low carb, but we do want to have them. And sometimes we want to have a little bit more, because it's going to give us that little bit of a leptin boost. And then just jumping on an anti-inflammatory diet, because inflammation is going to have an impact on our hunger hormones, which we're already doing. That's why we eliminate as much as possible the gluten, the dairy, the grains, the inflammatory oils, all of those things, right? So a lot of the things that you're doing are already helping. But if you're currently doing the program, if you're not, like, let's say you're done the program, I want you to go through this checklist, okay? And I want you to be like, okay, check off what you are doing and highlight things that you need to work on, right? That's sort of like what you need to do. So it's kind of like, give yourself a little bit of assessment, especially if you're struggling with hunger and you're struggling with cravings, which I'm not going to have time to get into because it's already 10:30. So we'll do part 2 maybe next week or something. But understand that if you are struggling with hunger, I want you to go through this list and check off anything that you're currently doing and highlight anything that you need to work on in order to manage your hunger, once again, from the bottom level all the way up into your brain. Now, what I would say, like the super key is, if you're already checking all of this off, you're like, yep, I'm like your star student, Haley. I do everything you tell me. I'm super consistent. I do all of this all the time. I'm a superstar, and you're still hungry. Then what I would say is you really need to dial in protein and fiber even more. So potentially you need to boost your protein intake to about 1 gram per pound of goal body weight. Potentially. So let's say your goal body weight is 140 and you're currently eating 100 grams of protein, then talk to me about boosting your protein up to 140, because again, that is going to be one of the major players in slowing down digestion and keeping ghrelin at bay. And then increasing your fiber intake, right? So, and there's different things that we can do to increase fiber. So obviously, if we can do it with whole foods, we do it with whole foods. We make sure we're getting plenty of vegetables, some berries, some nuts and seeds, avocado, but potentially you need to supplement with some additional fiber just to help with managing your hunger. So again, those are probably the 2 things that I would focus on. And then again, that hunger management formula, make sure that that is what you're doing. Make sure that you're doing it consistently so that you can have some control. All right. I know that some of you have popped in and out, and I see that somebody is still here with me. Do you have any questions about anything that I shared today? And what I'll do is I'll be sharing this Google document with you, so you'll have all of this on hand, of course. But any questions for me that I can help with based on what we just covered? Anything at all? Or any other questions on anything for that matter? And I know it takes a couple of seconds for the Facebook to catch up to me because of time lag. So I'll just wait a few more seconds. All right, I think we've got it all covered then. So that was it for today. I hope you found that helpful. If you did, if you like that, if you can just, leave me a little comment in the video, that would be fantastic. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And I will see you guys sometime next week. Bye.